For our final session of this first virtual Widening the Pipeline training, what I want us to keep in mind is the theme that we've been able to build up so solidly over the past few sessions. And when I think about it, most journalistic investigations, and including the very best ones, don't really begin as a quest to try to win a prestigious prize. For example, Seattle Times reporter Lulu Ramadan grew up in Palm Beach, Florida. And by the time she became a reporter for the Palm Beach Post, she was already very familiar with the clouds of black smoke that would billow from the sugarcane fields in the county each year after harvest season. But I'm fascinated with how Lulu and her team began the process of launching the Black Snow Reporting Project, which won a slew of top awards from the IRE and other organizations. And I think when I focus on it, what triggers me the most is that you saw a data project and a significant data project into something that you saw every day and took for granted even, and how you employed something called citizen science, which I really hadn't heard that term until I started looking into Black Snow and learning about that. So Lulu, why don't you start us off by telling us how that journey began?
Yeah. Thank you all for having me. Appreciate it. I hope this is helpful. So the story began, like Rachel said, I grew up in Palm Beach County and I was a reporter at the Palm Beach Post. And we had learned about a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of, it was seeking class action status on behalf of residents in the Glades, which is a rural farming community in the western part of our county. Pretty remote in terms of the parts of the county that we typically covered. And it was like a story, we had a story that one of our reporters wrote. It was like buried inside of a Tuesday paper. And it stood out because I hadn't heard about the farming practice of burning sugarcane. I wasn't familiar with it. So I started to dig into some of the court filings and reach out to some of the plaintiffs in the case who were vocal activists in the area. One of the court filings really stood out, and that was a 1991 rule filed by the Department of Agriculture, which was in charge of the farming practices. The rule barred sugarcane burning when the wind was blowing east toward the part of the county where the Palm Beach Post headquarters is, where in Palm Beach, in the town of Palm Beach, that's where Trump's Mar-a-Lago is, just to give you a clear idea, one of the richest zip codes in America. And then the suburbs where I grew up, so the burning was banned when the wind was blowing toward that part of the county, but it wasn't banned when it was burning west, when it was blowing west toward this mostly minority, low income area. So that quickly emerged as an environmental justice issue and told us it's definitely worth exploring. And it started with your traditional reporting and kind of grew into all these different ideas and ways that we could reach people in the community, measure pollution ourselves, which is where the citizen science comes in, and assess health impacts on the community ourselves, things that government officials had failed to do over the course of decades, which is part of the findings in our story. And we tried to, step in and fill in that information gap as much as possible.
That's one thing I definitely wanted to talk with you a bit more about and hear a little bit more about, because again, in our day-to-day work, sometimes we do take things for granted, or we've heard it all our lives, and people who say asthma is a problem and all sorts of cancers or whatever it is a community might be concerned about, that even sometimes we've heard it so much we take it for granted. So let's talk about this process of attempting to use citizen science or to create data where none exists to actually try to quantify some of these community concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. I can launch my presentation. So I've got So I have a presentation for you guys. Also, though, feel free to throw questions into the chat throughout, or just unmute and ask them. I'd be happy to answer as we go along. Don't feel like you have to wait till the end. But let's see. Let me know if you all can see this. Does that look okay? Can you see that all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So the presentation, like Rachel said, don't have data, collect it, how to incorporate citizen science into investigations. So hopefully you'll find some practical tips in here, as well as kind of what project planning looks like for an undertaking like this. So this is the first the opening of the story, which I hope you'll all take a look at. There's a really cool aspect to it that's like a scroll through data incorporated narrative. And a little about the story. So we were looking at sugarcane burning in Palm Beach County, specifically in the Glades region. Okay, there we go. Specifically in the Glades region, where you see those little dots, Pahokee, Belglade, and South Bay, about 30,000 people live in the area. West Palm Beach, where that other dot is, that's where the Palm Beach Post is based, and that's the county seat is there. And so the highlighted part is where the smoke was concentrated during sugarcane burning season. So in order to harvest sugarcane, farmers would burn fields for a little under an hour, sometimes about 40 minutes at a time, and about anywhere between, like, we're talking thousands of acres a day in the region, and the 400,000 acres of sugarcane is concentrated in this area. And it's the largest. Most of the nation's cane sugar comes from South Florida, from this region of South Florida. Let's see. Okay, so throughout the course of the reporting, we learned that the only government air monitor in the sugarcane burning region, which is that on this top, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this top left graphic there where it's pointing to Belglade, the only government monitor in the region had been found to be malfunctioning. Basically the EPA had flagged it for failing to produce accurate air quality monitoring readings. So I think someone mentioned Air Now as a link in the chat. So this is what produces the findings for Air Now, which is those air quality readings are a byproduct of a series of monitors operated by states and then overseen by the EPA. Sometimes the EPA will flag monitors because they're not producing accurate readouts, and they'll remove them from an official list, which means they can't be used to hold polluters accountable when they violate the Clean Air Act. So when pollution exceeds the standards, you can fine whoever, emitted that pollution, or force a government to regulate more tightly so that you get air to the quality that it's supposed to be on. Well, this monitor in particular had been flagged in 2013 and removed from the list. The EPA found it wasn't accurate enough to produce readings to measure against the Clean Air Act. But the state continued to operate it and continued to release monitor readouts as though they were accurate enough to, again, measure against the Clean Air Act. So knowing that, we decided what's one thing we can do in order to answer the question that residents had really raised for us, which is the air really clean? Because this narrative was playing out in the community where sugar growers were saying the air is fine, because if it weren't fine, the government would be fining us. The government would be coming down and saying, you're violating the Clean Air Act. When in reality, that wasn't something that was at their disposal because they didn't have a functioning air monitor in the area. So we'd consulted with a panel of academics. In this case, it was air quality and health experts across the country who have used low-cost air monitors to supplement government data and track air pollution. So the type of air sensor we used is right there in the center, the top center graphic, called Purple Air. Purple Air is the most popular air sensor on the market. Studies have shown that it's the most accurate among low-cost sensors, and it's so popular, in fact, that the EPA uses it and deploys it to rural areas and to tribal communities to fill in gaps where they don't have federal air monitoring. So we decided that that was the best choice. We partnered with people in the community, which we used through really targeted engagement tactics, which I'll talk about too. This was also an area that we as a paper hadn't covered in decades. This was a part of the community that frankly, you would never otherwise go to unless you had a reason to be there. You worked there or you had some kind of business there. You know, I like I said, I myself grew up in the community and rarely went out to the glades. And so there was a lot of trust building that needed to happen. And I recognized that from day one. And we needed to go out there. And the reason we knew that it was going to be a project that required time was because we couldn't swoop in and do exactly what had been done to this community time and time again, which is people come in, get a sound bite and leave. We really needed to build a bridge. And so we spent most of the front end just doing engagement reporting and building connections with members of the community and helping build that trust. And that's also one of the reasons why I should have mentioned too, this was a partnership with ProPublica through their local reporting network. My editor and I submitted the pitch to ProPublica to get the time to work on this. So as I'm sure everyone might know, a lot of local papers are strapped. There's not a lot of resources or time to be given to one reporter to work on something for a whole year. In this case, I was really fortunate to have the support of ProPublica and my paper, and we got to work on it. The graphic below just shows you how sugarcane's harvested, so you can get an idea of what the field burning looks like, that smoke. And then on the left is a text bot that we built to engage people in real time during burn events, which I'll also talk about. So this is what the sensor readouts looked like over the course of the burn season. So we collected air quality data in 10-minute increments overnight. We basically set up these sensors with people in the community who wanted to host them, specifically in Pahokee. When we had a control at the basically the suggestion of our academic partners, which was toward and away. So when smoke was blowing toward our air sensors, you could see that those spikes on that top graphic, and when smoke was pointed away, it was far more tame. So we knew we could draw a stronger conclusion that we were measuring pollution from sugarcane burning. So what is citizen science? We're not the first people to use this. I think it's one of the most clever tactics for journalists. And I would really recommend looking at these stories as well. They're just a handful of examples, but citizen science is basically when you're applying the scientific method to reporting, but also not even to just reporting. This is something that average American citizens use, and it's something that's more frequently adopted into government policy. The EPA even examines citizen science efforts. Academics examine citizen science efforts when they're trying to refine their own scientific techniques. So basically, by applying the scientific method, we're acknowledging that, hey, we're not PhD candidates, we're not academics, and we're not scientists, but we're trying to give you as much information as possible. A couple of examples here, WNYC also used purple air sensors and attached them to bicyclists in New York to measure pollution on bike lanes. There was the Toxic City series by the Philadelphia Inquirer, where they had, in one example with 6 schools, they had teachers take water samples from fountains to look at lead levels, and they'd sent those to a lab. With dangerous doses, that was the Chicago Tribune, they basically had academics tell them what prescription drug combinations had potential fatal effects, and tested it out themselves by going to different pharmacies and seeing if pharmacists would dole out doses that had fatal combinations. And so through taking those steps themselves, they could kind of establish the problems the same way we kind of tried to do with our sensors. So another aspect of the project, part 2 of the project, was focused on health, on public health, and we used state hospitalization and emergency room data. Again, this was at the advice of a panel of experts. We contacted health experts who regularly use this type of hospitalization data to examine environmental issues and their impacts on health, on public health. And we basically mimicked what had been carried out in other countries to establish a link between sugarcane burning and health outcomes. So a little background on sugarcane burning. It is a practice that is largely banned or being phased out in other countries. Brazil, for example, is the largest producer of sugar in the world, and they have banned sugarcane burning. So that also made us wonder why, if it's banned in Brazil, is this practice still popular and ongoing in Florida? So we mimicked the studies that had been carried out in Brazil and Thailand, for example, as well as one in Hawaii that looked at the health impacts of agricultural burns. And we used our own state data that we'd gotten from department. Also, I just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions too from the state. Okay. Also, feel free to say them out loud too, in case I don't check the chat. And this is a little timeline to give you an idea of what a project like this looks like. A lot of that foundational reporting that we mentioned, putting in records requests to all the departments that oversee agriculture, health, and environment in Florida and at the federal level, contacting those academics, reading reports, reading previous things that have been published. We also, after that, spent our time identifying that universe of people. We did, and I'll go into this with engagement reporting, but we did letter writing, we did phone banking, we went out into the community, and we consulted with our experts, set up our purple air sensors, we collected data, we wrote and edited and rewrote and re-edited, and all the while we were continually analyzing that data as it was coming in. And then we designed and developed it while we were still writing. So a lot of that involved a sort of cooperative, a collaborative kind of method of writing that was actually really new to me, where Ash New, our news apps developer, who was the data genius behind the project, helped kind of like organize the story so that our data was incorporated into the findings. Bulletproofing, which is your fact checking, running things back by your sources, and then publishing. So all of that was about a year, a little over a year. Yeah, it was a lot, but it was a great, very happy with how it turned out. And so
Lulu, I have a quick question about the text bot aspect. Was this the first time the paper had engaged text bots to get information, and how much of a response did you get?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, it was the first time that I personally ever used a text bot, but it wasn't the first time ProPublica had used it. So that's where the idea originated. In fact, ProPublica had just launched one about voting that seemed to be pretty successful. So that's where the idea kind of originated. And we managed to get about 60 people signed up for our text bot. And the thing about text bots is we understand now through like studies and through application that participation starts to taper out like over time. But the idea with the text bot was not to like quantify anything. Our questions were actually things that basically so that we knew who we should follow up with. The way the text bot worked was, and I'll show this too, but we had the text bot ready to deploy on significant burn days, is what we call them, days when they were burning more than 5,000 to 6,000 acres. And we knew that there would be significant smoke based on what people had described to us in the past. And we pulled together the text bot to ask questions like, are you seeing smoke? And then how are you feeling? And the questions were actually pretty much copied and pasted from an academic in Kentucky who actually launched an app called Smell My City in Pittsburgh that we'd consulted with him because we'd never done anything like that. And ProPublica hadn't used the text bot in this nature, where we were kind of collecting sort of personal anecdotes about how people were experiencing smoke and were they seeing pollution. So he helped us write those questions so that we could kind of narrow who's potentially having a health episode from exposure to smoke. And it was questions that and then some of them got more detailed. They allowed people to text in pictures, which they did. And so from there, instead of posting all of the replies, we followed up with the individuals who had experienced various, levels of it, and then interviewed them and kind of wrapped them in. So I can actually show you like this example here on the left is one of our sources, just to give you one screenshot. There are more too if you do the scroll through in the story, but one of the residents' experiences and how she answered. And this is animated in the story. So those dots at the bottom will show you what the text exchange actually looked like and how she answered it. And we followed up with her and talked to her about what she experienced, got her permission to publish the back and forth text exchange. And yeah, just to show one example of kind of what that looked like in real time. And the purpose behind it was that I mentioned that this is a pretty remote area. Sugarcane burns are really hard to track. They're permitted in the beginning of the day. The farmers request permits in the morning, but the times are bracketed, so they're allowed to burn their fields anytime between 9 and 5 p.m. and they burn for less than an hour. So when there's a really big burn, by the time I get out to Pahokee from where I am in West Palm Beach, the burn is going to be over because it's a little over an hour drive. And we recognize that, and we spent as much time there as possible, but this was also in the middle of COVID, which we didn't anticipate when we launched the project. We thought, let's go out there, let's stay out there and spend most of our time. But we really relied on people in the community to tell us when burns were happening, when they were bad burns, when they were really impacting the community, when they were happening close to schools, close to daycares, close to the hospital, all that. And for that reason, we thought a text bot where in real time people can tell us where these are happening and what they're seeing and take their pictures. Yeah, we thought that would be the best route.
Daisy, I'm going to let you know that I do see your question, and so that we don't break Lulu's stride, let's let her continue, and we'll definitely get to that question before this ends. So go ahead, Lulu.
Absolutely. Okay, great. So for engagement, we really wanted to make sure that we were building a bridge to the community, that they felt like they trusted us. This is also a company town. You know, that idea that most of the people who live in this community rely on the sugar industry for work. They're the largest employer in the region. Knowing that, it's already a stretch to ask people to trust us to start scrutinizing the industry that them or their family members or their neighbors work for. So we started by doing some community research. We looked at one recommendation from Maya Miller, who's an engagement reporter at ProPublica, super brilliant, and she was fantastic to work with. The American Community Survey, looking at things like internet access in the community, what the population makeup looks like, and catering your outreach to what the community looks like. Posting on a Facebook page was never going to work, even though that might have been what I did traditionally. Because this was a community where only a third of the households actually had internet access. So we interviewed our sort of core people to begin with, which started with like activists we knew, people who were plaintiffs in lawsuits, then kind of expanded it to community leaders. We started to reach out to pastors at churches because we'd heard that this was a particularly religious community. We started to reach out to the heads of nonprofits and ask them, who should we talk to? Who would be a good person to help connect us and help us build that trust? And after a while, it became those people who were taking us into the community who drove me around so I could post flyers in business windows. And like one head of a nonprofit, she drove me around the community and connected her with business owners she knew and said, hey, can Lulu post her flyer here? They're doing this really important story. And those business owners listened because they had already formed that trusting bond with the nonprofit leader. We wrote letters, we'd connected with teachers, which felt like a really good strategy at first because we knew that schools were somewhere where we had like this protected group of people that had experienced sugarcane burns immediately next. There are fields right next to playgrounds at schools that are set on fire. So a lot of that, just doing research, talking to people. Here's an example of what the letters look like. We hand wrote letters. We hand wrote some of them and then ended up photocopying a lot. I don't want to pretend like I wrote 200 letters by hand, but yeah, we got really good responses like this, where I got a text message from someone saying like, I reached that, I got your letter. I want to talk to you. I'll help in any way possible. And so we included bios in our letters. So you can kind of see in that picture on the right-hand side, Maya's picture is right in there. We included photos of myself and Maya, as well as our contact info and a little bio about what we'd done to kind of give people an idea of who we were, put a face to the name. And we told them that we'd maintain their privacy, but just asked, we take your privacy seriously, but let us know. We're trying to get insight. And that worked really well for people. This is how we tracked our interactions over the course of a year. I can't stress this enough. Like if you're doing a big project like this, try to stay as organized as you can on the front end. Here's like one snapshot of it. Like we talked to a lot of teachers, we talked to a lot of custodians, we talked to a lot of, workers, sugarcane workers, nonprofit leaders, like I mentioned. And we kept track of them by like putting, their phone numbers, what the last time we'd gotten in touch with them so we could continue to follow up. And then we also wanted to know, were they experiencing health problems? And then a little bit of a summary. Okay, so this question, did you find that handwriting letters was more personable than typing? And how did that choice come about? Yeah, that was something that Maya had recommended. Maya's done a lot of engagement reporting, and she thought that personalizing the letters was a better move because typing them out might look too form letterish. And again, just kind of giving an idea that this is a human being on the other end of this ask. This isn't someone just like typing out a letter and printing 200 copies, which I also agreed. It took a lot of personalization and kind of like being there to show people. And I can give one example, like one of the best moments during the reporting was like, I had attended a church service on one Sunday. Maya and I both did. It was a Zoom church service, and the pastor allowed us to make our appeal at the front end, and we gave a little like 2 to 3 minute kind of pitch, like this is what we're reporting on. We'd love to hear from you, and gave our contact info. And then maybe like a week or two later, I was at a food distribution site. So this was especially during COVID times. This is a particularly low income area. A lot of people rely on food donations and food distribution sites. So I went to one so that I could hand out more flyers, talk to people so they could see my face. And this was an outdoor one, so it was ideal at the time. And someone recognized me and was just like, "Oh, I met you at the church service. Do you remember?" And I was like, "Yes, of course. Like, thank you. I'm so glad you recognized me." And she said, "No, the work you do is so important. Can I reach out to you?" And so I gave her my cell number again, and she did reach out. And so I think the idea was to make it as personal as possible. And we got mixed reactions. I mean, most of the letters were not answered. I have to say, you send out 200 letters, you're lucky if maybe 20 people respond. But that 20 is already a huge chunk of the population, and they can connect you with others. Because again, that trust building also came from people introducing us to people that they knew. I hope that answers the question. So on data collection and analysis. So basically we had a few challenges. So the first was that we couldn't, again, sugarcane burning is really difficult to track. We didn't have timestamps for when the burns were happening. They were particularly short. So the EPA measures air quality in 24-hour averages, which we explain in the story is this sort of gap that allows short-term pollution to be missed by even the monitors that are functioning in rural and agricultural communities. And so in this case, we decided at the advice of experts to measure air quality in 10-minute increments so that we could see what the immediate and short-term air quality was like. But one of the pushbacks was like, well, that's not how the EPA measures for violations, and which is a fair point. We had some experts question whether that's actually the right way to measure air quality, if it's the best way to measure air quality. And we also had one former EPA committee member who oversaw the writing of this rule say that this was something that under the Biden administration they'd considered changing. And it's also over a really large area, and we had a finite number of monitors. So those are some of the challenges that we acknowledged in our reporting. But we still felt like, based on our interactions with the academics, that we could call a sort of baseline, like, is this impacting the community analysis out of the air quality monitoring. So we decided to move forward with it. So our burn permits and smoke bloom data. So we scraped a couple of, so on a daily basis, I would scrape the burn permits from the Department of Agriculture so I could see how many acres were burned a day. We also moved forward to this top right graphic shows you what that looks like. That includes, there is the JSON files that showed you the shape. They're the shape files that show you the plumes. And there was a prediction tool that the Department of Agriculture used to predict, based on wind patterns, where the smoke would disperse using those plumes. So we scraped that. and we built a spreadsheet with all the permits. So the reason for scraping it was I had a really difficult time getting traditional files from the and records from the Department of Agriculture. So we thought if we scrape it, we'd be able to get it in real time and then run it past a final FOIA'd cut. So at the very tail end, we FOIA'd for all the data and compared it, and it matched up. So we were happy with what we'd scraped. But I had a really rough time getting just normal records from the Department of Agriculture. So we went that route. We also explored other alternative data sets before we went forward with measuring the data ourselves. One question our editors very aptly asked us was, do we need to do this? Is there another way that we could find out what the air quality is like without spending $2,000 on equipment and 6 months, measuring air quality? So we looked at NASA collects satellite data on smoke, which was interesting, but it also was not at the interval that we wanted. As you can see from these, they do one snapshot per day per 24-hour cycle. There were some interesting details in there. They definitely acknowledged a lot of agricultural smoke in Florida in their written files, but it wasn't enough to show us what the day-to-day was like for people living out there. And a little about the design. So this was supposed to be a video. I don't think that's not gonna work. Oops. But basically just to show you a little what that scroll through design, but I really recommend giving it a read. We explored different options when we were kind of working out, like these are some of the data kind of design elements that we'd considered when we had really deep conversations about what we were trying to convey with our story and the visuals and how they could interact. These were sort of round table, not actually, because we were all over Zoom. All of this, by the way, was reported during the pandemic, entirely remote. The three of us worked in 3 different states. Ash was in California, I was in Florida, Maya was in New York. None of us had ever met in person until months after this published. And I had an editor in Florida and an editor in New York. But we had discussions and we looped in our photographer every time I went. So all of the on the ground reporting was just me in Florida with my photographer and videographer, Greg and Thomas. And it was mostly Thomas, but the two of us, every time I was in the Glades, he was there with me. So he was there through the entire year of reporting. And the two of us went out and really just talked to people. And then Maya was so involved, from FaceTiming residents to doing everything she could to be there without actually being there. And Ash was busy on the back end doing all this awesome data analysis. But to give you an idea of kind of what those conversations look like and the different iterations the story design goes through, we had at one point, just to give one example, at one point we had the background video had actual fire in the back, and we thought that was a little too ominous, that it wasn't really, it looked like a town on fire, not like what we were trying to explain, which was the harm was from the smoke. And this is kind of, we used Mapbox, which is a tool that Ash is really familiar with, that is sort of more like a cinematic tool to kind of do this sort of, you would zoom in. I'm not doing the description justice, by the way. If you want to right now and just scroll through the story, but zooms into the area so you get a sense of place of where we are in Florida, highlights where the sugarcane is, and all the while there are bits of text that I co-wrote with Ash to explain what you're seeing data-wise. Incorporating the data into writing. Basically, making this as collaborative as possible is a huge tip that I would give people. Is if you're doing the data analysis yourself, this could be a lot easier to kind of visualize, but when you're not and you have it and you're working with a really talented data reporter or editor or group, you kind of want to give them some leeway. You're the writer, sure, but you want to understand what their vision is. So with Ash had some hand-drawn early iterations of those graphics and would paste them into my Google Doc, where she imagined that as I was scrolling through, the text would be interrupted by this image that showed the state of Florida or the sensor finding findings. And as I got a sense of where Ash imagined those would pop up, we would go back and forth and like tighten the text and rewrite. And I knew that, oh, okay, if Ash wants this graphic to show up within the first 6 paragraphs, that means I only have 6 paragraphs to write my lead before we get right into like those graphics. So we storyboarded that way. We had our photographers and videographer involved in those conversations, and I gave them copies of my early drafts so they could imagine where the photos would appear in the story. Bulletproofing, you also want to run your analysis. If you're doing this sort of citizen science approach, you're going to want to run that analysis back towards your experts. And there are a couple benefits of that. One, like we communicated with I call this an informal panel of experts, because it's really hard to get academics to, like, if it were like a formal thing, like people were like, why didn't you just partner with a university and do it? They really wanted to, but there's this whole bureaucratic back and forth that you have to go through to get approval from a university to partner with them. So they were so excited about the project that they wanted to act as informal advisors. So they just answered all of our emails whenever we had questions. We had back and forths where I would like send pictures of the sensor setup and be like, is this okay? And they'd be like, actually, you should probably move it a little bit further from the bushes and things like that. Once we collected the data and analyzed it, we also ran it past them. That means they were also there to defend the work. So when the sugar companies eventually attacked the project, when we came to them for comment, and we gave them months to go over our questions and our findings, and it was a little over 2 months that they had with our questions. And they attacked it all. They said, you're not academics. How can we take this seriously? We had our academics come out and say, well, actually, they didn't come up with this methodology. We did. This is methodology that we use and that the EPA uses. We're very transparent. We included that very methodology in our story. And we also included it when we sought comment and interviews from the sugar companies. We built in data checks for every single analysis. So the sensor analysis, Ash did. I did the health and hospitalization data analysis. So we built in these checks because each of us are just individual data reporters. So above Ash was Al Shaw at ProPublica, and above me was Hannah Fresquez at ProPublica. And every time we analyzed our data, we'd send that analysis and all of our methodology, our code and everything to, in my case, like I sent it to Hannah and Ash sent it to Al, and they checked us because you want to make sure, just like you're fact checking a story, you're also fact checking your data. And then circle back with your sources. I want a good example of this. We wrote letters at the tail end after the story came out. We put a bit.ly link in the letters and we mailed them back out to our original school district employees that we'd sought out and sent letters to begin with. And it felt like a really good way to, again, we'd connected with a lot of them individually, but like even the people who didn't respond to the letters, we wanted them to know that like, we appreciate that, I hope this letter found you well, and we appreciate everything you've done. We hope that at the very least you'll read it. And I think that went a long way, because a lot of people who didn't even appear as sources in the stories had reached out to us after the story published, and that felt really good. This slide, just to show you, it takes a village. A project like this is definitely not one person. This was everyone I just described. And so, it was really great working with Maya and Ash, but we also had our editors, our photographers, videographer, news apps, all of that. And that's my email address. So sorry for zooming through that. I hope
no, absolutely perfect, because it gives us enough time, because I'm sure there are questions, but why don't we start with the one from Daisy, which is particularly important to me because I've been hearing over these past handful of years about all these amazing collaborations with ProPublica and individual organizations. And so Daisy wanted to know, at what point did the Palm Beach Post, you or whatever, decide that we should try to find someone like ProPublica or them to partner with us? And then give us a little insight into the pitching process. How do you do that?
Yeah, that is a great question, Daisy. So I started reporting on this project in June 2019. That was when the lawsuit was first filed that I mentioned. So June 2019, the story didn't publish until July 2021, just to give you an idea. I was on the investigative team, and we recognized right away that it would be a heavy lift, and I kept getting pulled aside into other projects and other assignments. And so I talked to my editor about the local reporting network, which I'd heard about at IRE and through friends who had also participated in the local reporting network. And so we pulled together a pitch that I ran by some colleagues who had also pitched and had been successful and partnered with local reporting network. So I'll open invitation now. If any of you ever want to pitch to them, I'd be happy to look over an application. I'm still a fellow with ProPublica now for 3 more years, so I'm still working with them. But anyway, basically the pitch had all of your, it was like a 2-page pitch kind of summarizing, here's how sugarcane is burned, here's what the sugar industry is. This is an incredibly politically powerful industry with really, really deep roots in this community where people rely on sugar for jobs, but they're also exposed to the environmental hazards of the harvest practices. We included a couple of data sets that I'd already gotten my hands on, which included the hospitalization data and some of the burn permits that I'd scraped. We included some of our early ideas. I will say now that the first idea that I pitched actually got scooped. So maybe that as a lesson for never giving up, because I was pretty bummed after that. My original story, so someone also asked, where did you find those source addresses? We had a teacher database. So a database in Florida, bless their records laws, because you can get anything, but I got a database with every name of the teacher in the county, their home address and their phone number, email address. So yeah, it was fantastic. And we isolated people who lived in that community, teachers who lived in that community and taught in that community. And the reason being was I was planning to center the first story. I was going to do a sort of magazine style narrative on one day in particular, which was a day in 2009 where a really bad burn had happened next to an elementary school and 9 kids were hospitalized. So basically the burn got out of control, smoke really flooded into the school, 9 kids went to the hospital, 16 were treated on site. And it was supposed to illustrate like this really, really stark example of like what happens when you're using a practice like cane burning so close to places where people just exist and live, including schools, daycares, senior centers, hospitals. And as we were reporting that out, we'd already sent letters to those teachers. Grist, the environmental magazine, fantastic reporter, fantastic magazine. They published the exact same story. I was like, oh gosh, that was like a knife to the heart. One thing that we noticed right away was like in that excellent story, you could see the back and forth with the sugar companies where they're like, this is bad for you? Prove it. Where's the evidence? Look, the air quality is fantastic. And I was like, wait a minute. They're right. Like you look at government data and the air looks like it's cleaner than any of it. In fact, that's a line that they used in the material that they would release in the community is like, this is the cleanest air in Florida. And I'm like, how is it possible that a place where they're burning 400,000 acres can have the cleanest air in the state? And that was the same question that people were raising. So we were like, if this is what people want to know, then this is what we should answer. So let's dig into it. So we looked into whether government agencies had ever studied it. And we found that the health department had produced studies that recommended sort of health analysis and an air pollution analysis that the state never followed up on. So that was like the first failure. Then we found out that the government air monitor was malfunctioning. Second failure. And kind of from there, it led us to this idea of like, well, what if we test the air ourselves? Long-winded answer to the pitch question, but like the pitch included a few stories and a few variations that we could take. And one included that school's narrative and another included that health analysis, which is something that I'd always wanted to do using hospital data. And we did mention air quality. I'd already connected with people and academics had recommended like, hey, have you considered testing the air yourselves? There are these low-cost sensors that you can buy. So that was also included in the pitch. And we fleshed them out a little. I did some of the base reporting. Again, I'd reached out to the lawyers in that class action suit, some of the plaintiffs, activists, and done a little bit of that research. Again, scraped that data, got the hospital data. You kind of want to build your pitch so that you can show that this story has you want to include like a minimum and a maximum. So like at a minimum, I was like, we can tell this narrative of what it's like for people living in this community. And it's a powerful one. This is a low income community that is solely exposed to this, hazard, this potential hazard. And while other parts of the community, and at the time Trump was president, and I gave the example in the pitch of like a straight shot 40 miles, literally a straight shot. It's the exact state road 80 from Mar-a-Lago, 40 miles away to Belle Glade. That's how close it is to the richest zip code in America. And this is the area that's being, exposed to this cane burning exclusively. So those are some of the details I included to sort of pique their interest. And then the pitch process followed up with like an interview with one ProPublica reporter and then the heads of the local reporting network. And then they wanted to partner, which was awesome. And that's when I connected with Maya right off the bat. And then later with Ash, once we decided that the data was just going to be such a heavy load that we couldn't do it ourselves. So
this is invaluable information. Raphael, we're definitely going to get to you, but I had promised Amanda earlier that one of our speakers would probably speak directly to the idea that you might have been thinking about or the project that you want to work on. So why don't you jump in here and ask your question?
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Lulu. I have so many questions. I'm so intrigued by this. I guess I'll focus on two. One, I'm really curious what was the impact of the story, and if that was something that was kind of important to you from the get-go, that your reporting and all of this, years of work lead to some sort of impact afterwards. And then my other question is kind of on a different topic, but one of the things we've all been talking and thinking a lot about is objectivity. And I'm so curious about your process and working so closely with your sources. I think we often, as reporters, are trained to think about having a distance. And obviously that was very different in your process. And I'm just very interested to hear your thoughts on that, whether obviously it was really important to strengthening the work, but I wonder if there was a trade-off there where you felt like it opened you up to critiques, or kind of how you navigated that in your process.
Yeah, those are really good questions. Yeah. Okay, so the first one, well, actually, I'll do the second one first with the objectivity and building that kind of bridge the community. So one thing we knew early on is we were dealing with a particularly litigious industry, a very powerful industry, and we knew that they were going to criticize everything that we did. And I was right. They really, really did. There were personal attacks. There were some very terribly photoshopped photos of me and on some really sketchy, Florida political blogs, where they photoshopped my face next to $100 bills and insinuated that I'd gotten paid to do the story. So that's always fun. But the point being was, when I first had a conversation, I should also mention, part of that early reporting process, I went directly to the sugar industry. The largest producer of sugar in the entire country is US Sugar. And I reached out to them and I said, meet with me. I want to talk. I want to understand. I read this lawsuit. I know the ins and outs of it, but I want to hear your side. I did the same with Florida Crystals, which is the second largest. And Florida Crystals didn't respond. US Sugar was like, let's have a meeting. And we met and they said, how much time have you spent in the Glades? And I was like, if I'm going to be honest with you, I haven't spent a lot of time in the Glades. And they were like, well, this is all a myth. This is something that was concocted by a handful of activists. This isn't a problem. The burning, it dissipates so quickly. It doesn't impact the community. In fact, if you were to knock on any door in that city right now, I'm sure people would tell you the same. And I was like, okay, so I'll do it. So, and in doing that, the funny thing was, we tried to avoid talking to activists. They were so helpful on the front end, but they also understood that I was I can't rely on you as a source because the sugar industry says you have a stake in this and that you're getting something out of it. So while you're incredibly helpful, I've got to go talk to all the people that I would not otherwise reach. And so I started knocking on doors in the community and talking to people. And it was something that was I felt I really had to build a sense of trust and a connection to people, because this was a community that we hadn't covered. We'd failed them in not covering the Glades for decades. We had failed them. There were stories that they told me about that we'd never written, where their roads were crumbling. And they were like, why is our town council not fixing the roads? And I'm like, that's a great question. If this were West Palm Beach, we would have written that story yesterday, but we ignored this area. And I had to acknowledge that and to say that failure is on me because I'm part of an institution that failed you. And so I think objectivity is something that we're exploring a lot in the industry and we're having conversations about, but in this recognition that there are underserved communities that we are both part of and are now tasked with covering, hopefully, that we need to acknowledge like the ways that we've failed and establish that trust, because the fact is we take it for granted, but we have that trust in the communities that get our papers delivered. Like when they get a call from a reporter, they're like, oh, you're the name in the paper that I see every morning when I pick it up. So I don't know if that answers your question. I feel like it was something that I felt like it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, I was kind of trying to ask more about like the citizen science aspect of it and how you were like actively working on your project with all your sources, and really like it seemed very collaborative in the approach. And I was wondering about that kind of side of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, we needed them. The sensors had to be hosted in the community. And through conversations with people, there were people who were really interested in hosting the sensors. And that was great because we wanted to make them feel as involved in the reporting as possible in, because that's what made sense with the approach we were taking. So we didn't just like collect the data. They had access to it. I think one of the best anecdotes we had was one of our sensor hosts who worked in a neighboring town would check his sensors during the day and send his mom when he saw spikes, because she was still at his house in Pokey. And he would text his mom and be like, hey mom, you should go inside, take the kids inside, get the clothes off the line, because the ash would stain your clothes if you left them outside on a clothing line. And so they felt like they were part of it. And so at the end of it, they had their own takeaways, and we were able to go to them and ask them what their thoughts were. And so it made sense because they needed to. We couldn't have placed the sensors anywhere without them. We needed them to be where people are. And And to your first question about the impact, so they're still burning sugarcane in South Florida. And that's particularly disappointing. I can say that because you're not, I guess we have these conversations too about like when we're considering impact and whether we have like a sort of goal in mind with our reporting. And I think in the back of my mind, though I didn't really acknowledge this necessarily in my pitch, it was like, sugarcane burning should be banned. It's banned in India. It's banned in Brazil. It's banned in Thailand. It's banned in the entire EU. Why is it not banned here? And one of the
is it banned in Canada?
I don't know if they grow sugar in Canada.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Land for Canada.
I don't think they do. The largest producers are India, Thailand, or Brazil, India, and Thailand, and they've all banned the practice. And we actually followed up a lot with Brazil. Part 4 of the story was a short documentary where we talked to Brazilian farmers and growers about what that transition away from burning was like. And then we followed up with that with like a community event where they spoke about what the transition was like. And we're pretty critical of the US. Like some of these farmers were like, we think of the US as like a first world country. So when you told us that they were still burning sugarcane, we were shocked. But anyway, so the impact has largely been on the air quality side, where legislation just passed at the federal level to dedicate money to rural air quality monitoring. And they cited our story. Members of Congress cited our story and pushing for the money for environmental justice and rural air monitoring, which is a huge gap that we mentioned in our story, that this could be happening elsewhere in the country. We just wouldn't know because the air monitoring laws don't mandate that we measure air quality in those areas. And then the other is this, that they've replaced the air monitor. So there is now a functioning one, so they can actually hold violators accountable for Clean Air Act violations should they occur. Some of the academics we partnered with actually got a grant and partnered with NASA to do the exact, basically expand on the study we've done. They're going to buy 150 purple air monitors, and starting next season, they're going to put them throughout the community and measure air pollution and formally do a study, which was something that had been missing and something that the sugarcane industry had pointed out. Even in their lawsuit, they were like, there are no studies that show the health impacts or the pollution impacts from cane burning in Florida. And they were right about that. But now they'll finally have a study from NASA, which is cool. So that's pretty exciting.
Is Raphael still here? It looks like he may not be here. So are there any other questions? Any other, take this opportunity while we have it.
I just had a quick question about, I think you might have like sort of touched on it, but the follow-up, because like obviously you build this great connection with this community, like, and then you're like gone, you know, in a way, like the story kind of ends. So I wonder for them, like what might have happened, or if you have any idea, like how they feel, you know, having been like part of such a great project and now the project is over.
Yeah, we've stayed in touch with some of our core sources too, for the follow-ups, which has been really, really great. They were involved in that community event I mentioned, which we did in March, so last month, which was really nice. But the fact is, I also left. I left Florida and I'm in Seattle now. We do have a reporter that the Palm Beach Post thankfully assigned to the topic, which is awesome. And it was something that we got a new executive editor during the course of this reporting, and he's really, I think he's put more of a focus and emphasis on communities that we haven't covered in a long time, particularly communities of color, which I think is fantastic. And I think all papers have to, you know, they should be thinking about how we like failed a lot of these communities. And so that's good. And I think there's more of a pipeline there, but at the end of the day, it's never enough. And it's sort of something that I think that I guess, I don't know if this is a tip so much as like look out for this, because you can become really, really invested personally. And it's kind of hard to separate that. Like the fact that I know that the community is going to be exposed to another cane burn come October, like is painful. And I'm like, I didn't do enough. And so it's really hard to make that separation. But our role as reporters is to document things as they happen, to expose injustices and information that wouldn't otherwise be out there, and try your best to kind of know that you're doing good with your reporting. But, you know, just because it's not doing everything that you might hopefully like down the line it will. But I think if I could give any bit of advice, yeah, I think getting personally invested is impossible to avoid, but don't let it like crush you, you know.
We'll take one more from Gabby, and then Raphael's connection dropped, but he sent us a text. So Gabby.
I actually have Raphael's question, so I was going to ask it for him. He said he had a question about the timeline and planning. Lulu, were you juggling other projects, and how did you break down the work to make it more manageable and actionable?
Yeah, I was really fortunate that I was only working on this project for that length of time, from June of 2020 through when we published in July. The first 2 months I was working on something else that once it came out, I was just cleared to work on this. That's part of the ProPublica local reporting network, by the way, is they clear a reporter, they pay a reporter's salary to the local paper so that they can clear your schedule. So if you're working for like the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and they're like, we can't clear you to work on this project, and you submit, ProPublica will pay your salary as long as the paper commits to clearing your schedule. And so as far as juggling goes, it was a lot because it was more work than I'd ever done with one project because there were so many moving parts. But I kind of just like sort of defined like loose kind of time, like goals, time-oriented goals, I guess. Like, oh, by the end of the month, I want to have made a connection with like 20 people who you know, live in this community and can talk to me about like what they've experienced. I try to keep track of everything in spreadsheets. I guess I'm also fortunate that I'm like a spreadsheet minded person. So those contacts, every time I had source conversations, fill them out in the spreadsheet. We even kept track of where we'd met people because I was doing that reporting in so many different ways. Like, was it someone texted us from a letter? Did someone write us a letter back? Did someone answer a door knock? Did someone answer a cold call? So that's how we'd connected with, and we'd mark how we connected with a lot of people. I kept track of, I kept everything in Google Drive folders, all of the records. I think I sort of tried to balance things where I like would spend part of my week doing like the records requests and reading, and then part being out in the community and doing reporting. Something I struggled with in the past was like doing too much reporting on the front end. You're just like staring at your computer screen or reading records all day, and you don't really get a sense of what's actually going on. So like try to spend as much time in the field reporting as possible. I just had regular conversations with my like colleagues, and that helped. So I guess, yeah, those are some of the tips if those help.
I'm going to give you probably what be my highest praise, Lulu, and that is after having been in the news journalism business for a couple of 100 years now, I almost want to go back into a newsroom so that I can employ some of the tactics and the ideas and have some of the experiences that you've outlined for us, and to be able to call on someone like you as one of my colleagues to help inspire me and help get me through an idea. So I can't thank you enough for taking time out to prepare this presentation for us and to give us some insight into this incredibly interesting and impactful project. So thank you so much.
That is far too kind, but thank you. Yeah. And seriously though, please reach out. I hope more people apply for like local reporting network stuff, or otherwise, if you ever would like someone to look over a pitch, I always send stuff to colleagues, former colleagues, and I'd be happy to.
No, I can't stress this enough, because again, when I think of my time in the newsroom, to even begin to take on a project like this, and to know that there was someone out there like you who would be willing to help me, what a difference that would have made in my journey. So we'll be in touch. We can promise you that. So thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I hope you have if this is the end of the training, or if you're still going, I hope it's great. And I hope I hear from you guys.
Take care.